for about half of us, we had no intention of coming back to a colony. We were looking forward. We were looking towards a new hope. It was in the Daily Jamaican newspaper that this troop ship would call to Jamaica in about 2 weeks' time, and the passage was 28 pounds 10 shillings. Let's get that straight. The average man didn't have 28 pounds 10 shillings. It was equivalent to about 3 cows. And in the evenings, they have boxing competition and things like that, and dance and all things. But the main thing is, it was to mentally get yourself ready to land. I would go in the lower deck and I would have 8, 10 of them. I said, look, food is ration in England. You can't grasp that. There's only any way to live because the bad Germans destroyed Britain. So to get accommodation, but work is all over the place. So work is not the problem. It's somewhere to live and food to eat. Once more of our people start coming and food still rationed, the unions blame the blacks for everything. Rubbish. And in the end, you have signs, keep Britain white, blacks go home and all that.
Is that by delegating what are essentially the functions of public servants out to employers, landlords, out to the private sector, there is the risk that you will have risk-averse employers, risk-averse landlords, and that if they're faced with 2 applicants for a tenancy, one of them has a British passport, the other might have documentation which proves their right to rent, but it's not a British passport because of some of the sanctions to which landlords and also employers could be subject. The default position is to err on the side of caution and to rent in favour or let in favour of the prospective tenant that has and shows a British passport. So I saw that as a significant risk in terms of individuals. And it was for that reason that, as you say, one of the recommendations was for a root and branch review as to the hostile environment policy. The difficulty at the moment is that the Home Office is not able to confirm whether or not the policy is achieving the policy objective. So is it successful? Is it resulting in the sorts of objectives that originally fueled it? We happen to know that voluntary returns, which were supposed to be an indicator of success, voluntary returns are down and have been down for quite some time. So how is the department assessing the effectiveness of its policies, and in this particular instance, the hostile environment policy? And when I talk about the department, I will, I'm afraid, reiterate, I mean both ministers and officials, because ministers set the policy objective, officials implement the policy objective, and they have joint and shared responsibilities for ensuring that their policies are effective and that they operate as envisaged. And what the Windrush scandal shows is that that didn't happen. We saw no evidence of social policy research being used to inform the policy objective. We also saw no evidence of officials flagging up potential risks, and that is despite the fact that there were warning signs both within the Home Office itself and outside of the Home Office that there would be a group, a cohort of individuals who had every right to be in the UK, but who lacked the documentation to prove it, and who therefore could be subject to sanctions to which they should not be subject. And we saw the harm and the significant detriment that was caused to those members of the Windrush group. So, in answer to your question, in terms of the essential recommendations that should be implemented, I'd say my recommendations boil down to 3 elements. The first is that the Home Office has got to acknowledge the wrong that's been done. The second is that it should open itself up to wider external scrutiny. And the third is that it has to change its culture to recognise that migration and wider Home Office policy has to be rooted in humanity and dignity, no matter what the objective. And so I look at this through a slightly different lens. I look at this in the form of there should be indicators that changes are occurring. And the sorts of indicators for me are firstly that the Home Office has reached out and identified the hidden Windrush people who haven't yet applied to any of the schemes because either they're too frightened to come forward or they just don't trust the assurances that the Home Office has given. Success will be that the department is seen to be compensating those who've been affected swiftly and sensitively. And in the limited outreach work that I've been able to do since COVID and since the publication of the report, I have to say that the compensation scheme is the single issue that is raised the most. Whatever the whys and wherefores, the information I'm receiving universally is that the current system isn't working. And the Home Office should be using the compensation scheme as an example to show that they're beginning to learn the lessons. Yes, it's going to take time. Yes, we're talking about public money, but by demonstrating that the scheme is operating effectively and that the department is treating claimants sensitively and with discretion, recognising that some heads of compensation will take longer to assess than others, I would say that interim payments should be being made far more quickly than is currently the case. And at the time of the publication of my report makes clear that claimants raised concerns about the complexity of the compensation scheme application form and the levels of proof that were required. And I raised the risk that some of the more prominent features of the Windrush scandal were playing out again or were at risk of playing out again in respect of the compensation scheme. So if these concerns aren't addressed, then that demonstrates to me that the department is not learning the lessons. And I will end by saying the department envisaged that there would be 15,000 claimants as part of the compensation scheme. Only a fraction of that number have actually come forward and made claims. And so it would seem that the system isn't working and some of the issues that laid the scandal bare are still operating as we speak. Unmuted. I think that this was potentially the case, although my remit was to look at the policy, operational or legislative factors that led to the Windrush generation being caught up in enforcement measures that were designed for those who are here illegally and to identify what lessons could be learned. And so this aspect didn't fall specifically within my consideration because I wasn't looking at whether human rights had been breached in individual cases. However, failing to look or to be aware of risks and not addressing them can in itself create barriers and hide disasters. And institutional ignorance or thoughtlessness by those in any public body towards race or the history of a racial group is capable of increasing that risk, that body's decisions are either inappropriate or incompatible with human rights. And I did find that there were a number of institutional factors that were relevant at the time of the review, and I can go into those if there is time. But I also considered this committee's own report into Windrush, which was published in 2018, and noted in particular the committee's finding that the Home Office seemed to conflate issues of status with the right to detain. Now, as the committee is aware, the Windrush generation, by virtue of their arrival in the UK before 1973, and Baroness Lawrence is absolutely right, that was in response to an invitation to come and rebuild post-war Britain, they had deemed leave or the right of abode. And I would agree with a number of the committee's findings in relation to the cases involving the two individuals that were named in the committee's report. And I'd say that having had access to all of the 164 Windrush cases that the Home Office referred to me, there were some common features, and as I say, with which I would concur as far as the committee is concerned. The first was that there was a lack of awareness of the rights, and in this case of the rights conferred on this cohort, namely the Windrush generation, by virtue of the 71 Act. The second was that the Home Office ignored evidence which supported the accounts of the individuals who were making applications. The third is that, and this is the important point, the Home Office placed an unreasonable burden of proving status on those who were making the applications rather than the correct standard of proof, bearing in mind that these individuals were applying to confirm a right. They weren't applying to establish a right afresh. The next aspect with which I would agree is that the department, the Home Office, demonstrated a culture that was hostile and that failed to treat individuals as deserving respect and dignity. And I've gone further than that in my review. In my report, I stated that there was a culture of disbelief and a culture of carelessness. Disbelief because the starting point appeared to be on the part of Home Office staff disproving the claims that were being made. Carelessness because my report makes clear, and we managed to identify the internal Home Office circular, which dated back to 2006, by the Home Office to its staff, which made clear that if members of the Windrush cohort applied to regulate their status, their applications were to be treated with sensitivity and discretion. And it's for that reason that I've said that the Windrush generation were institutionally forgotten. The department completely forgot about them. And I talk about a failure to heed the warning signs, which, as I've said earlier, were both internal and external. And I've talked about the detrimental impact that this had on people's lives. And it isn't just the Windrush generation themselves, it is their children and their grandchildren. I ran a series of road shows whilst carrying out the review, and I heard from individuals who had been denied university places because their grandparent status had not been confirmed. And so I think that the effects of the Windrush scandal were far-reaching, and I have said the scandal was a long time in the making. So to summarise, I've identified institutional factors, cultural factors, and political factors which formed a corrosive cocktail and led to the appalling outcomes that we've seen. And as this committee and as the evidence this afternoon makes clear, that has got to change, and the department has to transform itself.